Most suspension shocks will have settings that allow you to adjust how they perform. Not getting these settings right can mean the bike won't grip as well as it should and can actually end up making the bike harder to control. Stay tuned and we'll explain how you can make sure your suspension setup is working for you, not against you. Before you start, it's important to have your full riding arsenal to hand, as you'll be setting up the shock based on your riding weight. It's a good idea to get set up before you ride, but take a shock pump with you so you can make further adjustments on the trail. There are three main controls you'll see on mountain bike suspension: preload, rebound damping, and compression damping, sometimes split into high-speed and low-speed compression on top-end shocks. Preload is a resistance the fork gives against your weight. So the heavier you are, the more preload you're going to need. For a shock with a coil spring, this would equate to a heavier or thicker spring. But for an air shock, it's simply a case of pumping in more pressure. Compression damping comes from the internals of the shock and works by regulating the flow of oil through small holes. Compression damping only affects the shock when it's compressing. This doesn't affect the preload, but can appear to have a similar effect on the rear suspension. The more compression you dial in, the slower the fork will move through its travel. This is good if you want a bike to pedal without bobbing, but the negative effect will be the limitation of the suspension's movement when you hit a bump, making it feel a bit like it's locked out. In fact, suspension lockout is simply an extremely high amount of compression damping. Rebound damping is a similar internal system to compression and only affects the shock when it's returning to its natural position after an impact. The more rebound damping you dial in, the slower the shock will return to its natural position after an impact. A slower return, or rather more rebound damping, is required if the bike feels like it's trying to buck you off, especially after corners or when you land a jump. But if repeated hits are causing the suspension to feel like it's packing down and not returning to its natural position, then you need less damping. Your suspension might feature presets that are designed to give it different characteristics for different types of riding. Lockout is the most common, and when activated will use the compression damping system to effectively stop the fork from working. Lockout is useful when you encounter prolonged climbs or flatter pedaling sections. CTD, or climb, trail, descend, is a slightly more advanced form of lockout that gives a tune that's better suited to the type of terrain you're riding on. Climb mode pretty much acts as a lockout, although typically will allow more movement. Trail, or ride mode, is a slightly stiffened setting to allow movement, but with some resistance in order to give a good pedaling platform with a stiffer compression setting, while descend means the suspension is fully active and would offer little compression damping during use. CTD is a Fox-specific term, but other manufacturers have comparable systems. It's a good idea to have someone to help, but it's possible to set the sag yourself by leaning on a wall or solid object. Start by measuring the inner part of the shock. This is the smaller part that moves inside the larger outer can. Divide that by 4. This is your sag measurement. For optimum performance, you need 25% sag. However, some more aggressive shocks, like those found on downhill bikes, can be set with up to 30%. Most shocks will have a small rubber ring or foam bump stopper to allow you to measure the amount of sag. If yours hasn't, you can tie a rubber band around it. Don't be tempted to use a cable tie, and certainly don't leave it in place. The dirt it collects, combined with a hard plastic, will scratch the surface, and that's not a cheap replacement. Set the compression damping switch to descend, or its open position. Reset the sag ring, gently mount the bike, and assume the standing riding position. Try not to bounce the bike. You're looking for a standing weight. Carefully dismount and check the sag distance. For most riders using air shocks, 150 to 200 psi will give around 25% sag. So if you have no idea what pressure to run, then pump in or release air until the gauge shows 150 psi. Then add or subtract 25 to 50 psi until you arrive at 25%. For coil-sprung shocks, you can make minor adjustments using the preload dial, but might need a heavier or lighter spring depending on your weight. These should be available from any good bike shop. Depending on your shock model, you'll have a CTD switch or compression dial, as well as a rebound damping dial. If you have a CTD, then set it up according to your current terrain. If you have a dial, then set it up in a similar way to your rebound damping as follows. Start by working out how many clicks of range you have in the dial. Wind the dial fully in clockwise. Then wind it back out. As you wind it out, count the clicks. If you aren't sure what you need, or have a new shock, you'd be well advised to set the dials around the middle of the range. You can then experiment by 1 or 2 clicks at a time either way, until the desired setup is achieved. It's quite rare that taking either compression or rebound to the extremes will have much benefit, so most riders will want to stay near the center. Remember, different trails and terrain will have different setup requirements, so it's a good idea to get a feel for what the dials are actually doing in terms of suspension action. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the rest of the channel. Let us know what you want more of on your BikeRadar.